Right. Good evening, everybody. I think most of you know who I am. As a way of introduction, I am not a military historian, nor by no means an expert on this subject. My interest started as I started with my family history research. I was presented with a collection of papers, old photographs, memorabilia, and some old medals. I suppose the medals attracted me first, and not knowing what they were, sought out one, a Johan Low, who explained the medals, their significance, and why they were awarded. I felt that when doing family research, apart from knowing the nuts and bolts of deaths, births, etc., it would be more meaningful if I understand and included events which happened to my ancestors. I suppose one could merely note Slingsby, born 1886, served in the Boer War, First World War, and Second World War, and so on. This, however, did not satisfy me. I've concentrated more in general terms and quoted from the feelings of the men who took part and to whom I felt my grandfather had a similar experience. He was not a hero in the war. He was just an ordinary man that did his service and served his country when called upon. So the bibliography that I've used is several books. One was They Fought for King and Kaiser by James Ambrose Brown, The Battle for the Bundu by Charles Milner, Karia Corps, Geoffrey Hodges, Urgent Imperial Service, Gerald Lange, From Playgrounds to Battlefields, Piet van der Bijl, and Louis Botha's War by Adam Cruz. I have used information from the internet and from Wikipedia. Some of the pictures are from the internet, and some of the pictures are from my grandfather's own photograph album, which unfortunately he let his children, my father and my uncles, get into, and some of which they'd scribbled over, but some of them they left behind. So those are the ones that we can probably see. These are the medals that he had, which I had no idea of what they meant when I inherited these medals. They were in a terrible state, and Johan Low, whose interest in medals, he reconstructed them and put new ribbons on. From the left-hand side, there is a military MBE. That means he was a member of the British Empire. That one. The Boer War Medal, which they call a QSA, Queen's Service Award. The 1914 5-star. The British War Medal, 1914-1920. The Allied Victory Medal, 1914-1919. World War II, this one is the 1939-1945 British Service Medal and the Africa Service Medal. Charles Richard Slingsby was born in Mossel Bay on the 17th of May, 1886. His parents, William Edward Slingsby and Jane Isabel Slingsby, née Solomon, in the uniform of the Stellenbosch Home Guard. This unit was established in 1901 due to the increased fear of rebellion and incursions in the area. The British Army had its remount stations on the farms Koelenhof, Geluksoord, and Nooit Gedacht. Whether he was involved here, I do not know. The Army did employ several grooms. A lot of research at the archives, I could never find that his name was on any roll. He may have been employed here as he attested to this unit for an application to join up in World War I. These remount farms became famous for another reason. When Lord Roberts sent all the idlers, ne'er-do-wells, and army dropouts to assist. The term Stellenbosching was used as a polite word of getting rid of them from the army. The word Stellenbosch was found in the Oxford Dictionary. Rudyard Kipling in Daily Express wrote, "After all," said one cheekily, "what does it matter, old man? You're bound to be Stellenbosch in 3 days." Charles's father, the Reverend William Slingsby, was the padre of St. Mary's Anglican Church. He noted how divided the people of Stellenbosch became during the conflict on all sides of the home language spoken. On the 4th of August 1914, the King appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. To the wild ovation, the crowd assembled and applauded the royal party. Finally, to the singing of the national anthem, the royal party withdrew. Later, the following statement was issued from the Foreign Office. His Majesty's government has declared to the German government that a state of war exists between Great Britain and Germany, as from 11 p.m. on August the 4th, 1914. So began one of the bloodiest periods in the history of mankind. 60 million participants, 40 million casualties, which included 20 million civilian and military deaths. On the same day, General Louis Botha, the Prime Minister of South Africa, sent a message of support to the British government, suggesting British troops stationed in South Africa be released to fight the Germans in Europe. South Africa, in the government's view, could defend itself. The British response asked for South Africa to invade the German colony and to destroy the radio masts in Windhoek and the other coastal towns. This was a radio link from Berlin to the German fleet in the South Atlantic Ocean. The communication was a vital link between Berlin and the German Atlantic fleet. This was the mast before it was destroyed in Windhoek. South Africa was divided as to why support should be given to a king and a country that a mere 12 years previously had been an aggressor. Botha and his cabinet had eyes to incorporate German West Africa into South Africa. He was also pressurized by British Parliament, who threatened to send Australian troops, or even worse, Indian troops, to take over that country. This was a cartoon that appeared in a local newspaper of Botha trying to remake the map of South Africa. My grandfather Charles joins up 2 days after the Parliament agrees to invade German West Africa. Note at the top corner here, he's noted his rank is a conductor. That gave me a lot of problems in trying to research, because there didn't seem to be any rank in the army called a conductor. He certainly wasn't a musical conductor. I eventually discovered that the rank is still used in Australia, and it's equivalent to a warrant officer. And his rank was, because he was a conductor, was to conduct the horses to the officers and the men in the cavalry. An overview of the German West African campaign. South Africa's defense force consisted of volunteer units of citizen force divided into commandos, and they were in the main led by the ex-Boer generals. The so-called English-speaking units consisted likewise, for example, the Transvaal Scottish, the Cape Town Dukes, and the Highlanders, and units of cavalry such as the Imperial Light Horse. The chief staff appointed by Smuts was General Beyers. Botha had no time for Beyers and questioned Smuts' reasons for this appointment. In today's world, it is difficult to understand how a large force of volunteers could be assembled so quickly. The greatest virtue during this age regarded the king and God as supreme. Human life was of a temporary nature. Obedience was essential, with reasoning not to be encouraged. The empire was greater than the individual and was deserving of man's sacrifice. Almost immediately, troops entered German West Africa. General Luken at Romansdrift troops at Port North, Mackenzie at Luderitz and Walfish Bay. The war effort was disrupted when Botha and Smuts had to attend to the rebel uprising. Instantaneously, there was considerable sympathy among the Boer population of South Africa for the German cause. It was, after all, only 12 years since the Second Boer War, during which Germany had supported them. General Koos de la Rey held a meeting at Teerfontein. The same day, General Beyers resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the South African Army. Botha eventually took control, and with the assistance of Smuts, who took over the command in the south, pushed the German troops northwards to the eventual surrender after being defeated at Gibeon. The Germans, being defeated, surrendered on the 9th of July 1918. The swiftness of the campaign, despite many setbacks of poisoned wells, lack of water, was due in the main to the resilience of the Boer troops who applied the same tactics as employed during the Anglo-Boer War. Living off the land, the fast cavalry encircling the enemy and attacking them from both the front and the rear positions. Maritz, who was head of the commando forces of the border of German Southwest Africa, issued a proclamation. The former South African Republic and Orange Free State, as well as the Cape Province and Natal, are proclaimed free from British control and independent, and every white inhabitant of the mentioned areas, of whatever nationality, are hereby called upon to take their weapons in their hands and realize the long cherished a debate in Parliament was called. Botha, however, won the war debate on the 9th of September 1914 by 86 votes to 12 against. Herzog was the leader of the National Party, and this was a cartoon from the local newspaper. The first attempt to invade German West Africa was led by General Lucan and Percy Fitzpatrick, author of Jock of the Bushveld, from the south. It failed at Sandfontein. The day began with a battle and inevitably ended with a burial. The sun was low when 26 new graves were dug in a small cemetery in the town. Both sides lined up, with the Germans allowing the South Africans to bury their dead first. Today, Strandfontein is an upmarket game lodge. The rebellion was sparked by the accidental shooting of the old Boer General de la Rey, shot by a policeman, probably the worst shot that the police had ever employed. As the car sped through the roadblock, he was told to fire. He raised his rifle, but missed the target. Unfortunately for de la Rey, the bullet ricocheted off the road and hit de la Rey in the back. The roadblock was there to apprehend a criminal gang, and it wasn't placed there to prohibit political assemblies. This was the spark that the old Boer generals like de Wet, Wessels, de Villiers, and Serfontein needed to lead the Boers into rebellion. Maritz quickly gathered around about 12,000 sympathetic rebel supporters, known as the Maritz Rebellion. Martial law being declared on October the 14th, 1914. Botha and Smuts, then the Minister of Defense, led the government forces, which destroyed the rebellion. The rebels gathered at Mushroom Valley with a final showdown. Shells were fired. The rebellion came to an end in December 1914, which gave Botha time to concentrate on German West Africa. The Germans had also pledged their support, as their dream was to capture the Transvaal and Portuguese East Africa with a seaport at Delagoa Bay. The existing citizen force army was in tatters, and the new recruits had to be found. General Beyer drowned whilst attempting to escape the shelling. It was an extraordinary army that left South Africa, bound for German Southwest Africa. Not only was every man a volunteer, but the forces were led personally by the then Prime Minister, the ex-Boer General Louis Botha. The long supply lines to Windhoek meant a land invasion was impractical. The plans were made to land at Lübowitz. Protection at sea for the South African troops was provided by the British Navy. Walvis Bay and Swakopmund became an easier landing following the defeat of the German Navy during the Battle of the Falklands Islands. The British Navy totally destroyed the whole South Atlantic German fleet at that incident. By March 1915, the South Africans were ready, and 67,000 troops moving in 4 columns began the complete occupation of the German territory. Botha himself commanded the force that occupied Walvis Bay and Swakopmund in the north of the territory. During the campaign, the occupying forces encountered landmines, poisoned wells, as well as some stiff resistance. The capital of Windhoek was occupied on the 12th of May, 1915, by which time the South Africans had taken over most of the country. An attempt was made to persuade the Germans to surrender at this stage, but this was unsuccessful, and the campaign continued, the German forces gradually being squeezed into the northwest corner of the territory. German West Africa was defended by about 2,000 Schutztruppe, 4,000 reservists in the Landwehr, and about 480 policemen, led initially by von Heidenberg, following his death, Colonel Franco, under the overall command of Governor Seitz. It's interesting in this picture to note how the Boers were dressed in their sort of normal Boer War type uniform. They weren't going to be in the uniform of the British Army. Boredom, heat, flies, desert sands welcomed the South African troops. The invasion was taken along the established railway lines. These were often destroyed by the retreating Germans, but quickly replaced by the South Africans with a 3-foot 6-inch gauge as used in South Africa. The dust storms presented a bigger problem, as no sooner had one end of the train been freed when the other end was bogged down by the sand. The Great War saw the shift from men and animals to the beginning of men and machines. Light aircraft, flown by a pilot only, was to be seen in combat for the first time. Whilst a part of it played in reconnaissance and a minor part by dropping bombs by handheld are worth a mention. One story from this war remains. As a footsore young bugler from Rhodesia, Arthur Harris looked up after a battle and observed a returning plane and remarked to his friend that the pilot would soon be at home at the base with a beer. He vowed if he ever found himself in a similar circumstance, he too would join a force where he could be transported by mechanical means. At the end of this campaign, he returned to England, where he tried to join with the artillery as they rode on horses, and when he could not, where he would not have to walk again. However, he was rejected, and remembering the small plane he joined up with the Royal Flying Corps. He ended his military career as Marshal of the Air Force, Sir Arthur Harris, and well known in the Second World War as Bomber Harris. Food was scarce, and many of the troops were left to live off the land. They didn't seem to like the German mutton or the German lamb, and they were certainly shown in this cartoon. This is my grandfather. He's this fellow in the middle here, on the slide on the left. And these were postcards that he'd sent back from German West Africa. They were all stamped at the back by the censor, and there wasn't much information. I think it was sent more as proof of life than anything else. And the first one says, lots of love, Sonny. And the other one, how do you like my upper growth? He'd obviously grown a moustache during the time that he was there. July the 8th, 1915, the Governor Selt and the German army surrendered at kilometer 500 to General Botha. The terms of the surrender being wired, telegraphed to the Union Parliament sitting in Cape Town. After amendments, all issues were agreed and offered to the Germans to accept by 5 p.m. or face further hostilities. Some German officers, however, were unhappy, and the agreement was postponed until 2:30 a.m. the following morning. After an anxious wait, some 5 minutes after the deadline, a train's headlight was spotted. Botha ordered the troops ready to attack to hold fire. A German staff officer alighted with a signed peace proposal. The troops were ordered to stand down. The West African campaign was ended. After the celebration of Botha's return, with 50,000 men who fought to German West Africa, only 266 failed to return. 88 were killed in action, 25 died from being fatally wounded. Illness claimed 153 lives. These figures were less than those killed in the rebellion, where 131 royal troops and 190 rebels lost their lives. The Germans lost 103 killed and 195 wounded, with 890 being captured. Almost everyone brought back a souvenir of some kind, a German Mauser, a bayonet, or a fragment of shrapnel. Kun Brits even arrived home with a captured cannon, which resulted in a long debate with the customs officials. They gave way, however, after being told of Brits' mounted brigade, who had marched 460 miles and more across German West Africa, one of the greatest military marches of all time. My grandfather brought home some German bayonets, which were displayed at his home, and they were always admired. His son William, who had a business connections in Southwest Africa, many years later donated these items to the museum in Windhoek. The units were disbanded, and many of the Afrikaans-speaking community found it difficult to return home and live amongst the friends and family who had supported the rebels. Piet van der Bijl related the following story about the return home. General Botha, driving up Adderley Street with his staff, packed with cheering crowds. In his honor, a huge banquet had been arranged at the Mount Nelson Hotel. To a toast proposed by Sir Frederik de Waal, he replied in Afrikaans, with Bok translating, referring to some place in the last advance to Otavifontein, where there was difficulty in watering our horses due to the lack of pumping of the boreholes. He said in colloquial Afrikaans, toe ons by die plek kom, sê ek vir my staafoffisier van waterdienste, Freddy, trek uit jou broek en maak dat daar water is, which could be fully translated into slangy colloquial English as, when I come to this place, I said to my staff officer of water services, Freddy, pull up your socks and see that water is provided. Instead, Bok translated it literally as, when I came to the place, I said to my staff officer of water duties, Freddy, pull off your trousers and make water. There was a hushed silence in respect for the ladies present, and then a roar of laughter could be heard in Adderley Street. Most of the army was disbanded, some of the men going to fight with the British troops in Europe, or with the South African forces in German East Africa. Whilst the South African troops were engaged in the German West Africa, other members of the Commonwealth were tackling the Germans in East Africa. On Sunday, the 1st of November, 1914, 14 ancient transports arrived at the coast of German East Africa. These ships had rolled drunkenly across the Indian Ocean for 75,000 Indian Army sepoys with their English Army officers. Since leaving Bombay some 16 days earlier, the Indian Expeditionary Force B had found their way to the African coast. The Great War was 3 months old. The force commander, Major General Arthur Edward Aitken, with the assistance of the guns of the Royal Navy cruiser Fox, thought the assault on German East Africa as a routine maneuver, which would soon see he and his staff ensconced in a mess at Mombasa. He attempted to land at Tanga with a frontal assault. These were Indian troops with British Army officers, used to the good life, dressed in full mess kit for dinner, totally unprepared to fight in Africa. The 8,000 troops, equipped with 16 machine guns, the 6-inch guns of the Fox, were beaten by Von Lettow's 1,000 men with 4 machine guns. Von Lettow later recalled, the streets were literally strewn with dead and wounded. To add insult to injury, as the Indian troops fled back to the beach past the mangrove swamps, the Germans opened fire on the many beehive nests along the coast. This added to the speed of the retreat. This gives rise to another name, the Bees Battle. This decisive victory meant the German forces were re-equipped with modern British rifles, 16 machine guns, 500,000 rounds of small arms ordnance, and enough field telephones to supply the Schutztruppe and enough kit to supply them for a year. They left behind 700 bodies, at least 300 as corpses. Much had happened in 1914, most disastrous. The Western Front, devastated by the German machine gun, brought devastating news to the British newspapers, as pages and pages listed the dead. Elsewhere in British, Australian and New Zealand troops were being ripped apart at the Dardanelles to infiltrate the soft underbelly of Europe. Much worse was to follow. By 1916, British, French, and German casualties, dead and wounded, or missing, amounted to more than 1.5 million souls. The British forces, led by a new commander, was once again repulsed at a small port of Janssen, losing 500 men. Kitchener was furious and replaced the incompetent with the Irish-born Brigadier General Major Tighe. Lord Kitchener was shortly thereafter drowned on a secret mission on the cruiser HMS Hampshire. Before dying, however, he reluctantly gave permission for the reinforcement of British East Africa, where the Germans had taken charge. Smith Dorrien, who had faced the spears of the Zulus at Ishlawandu and the Boers a few years later, was appointed as a commander of the commander-in-chief. However, upon arrival in Cape Town, he was too ill to continue, and General Smuts was appointed as commander. The Germans should have been shown the door in East Africa. However, their talented commander, Col Paul Von Lettow, had other ideas. In fact, despite all the best efforts of the British and the Commonwealth forces, Von Lettow was never defeated. Lettow-Vorbeck's plan for the war was relatively simple. Knowing that East Africa would only be a sideshow to the other theatres of war, he was determined to tie down as many British troops as he could. He intended to keep them away from the Western Front, and in this way to contribute to the German war effort. Lettow-Vorbeck was the commander of a military garrison of 2,600 German nationals and 2,472 African soldiers in 14 Askari field companies. Feeling the need to seize the initiative, he disregarded the orders from Berlin and the colony's governor, Heinrich Snee. He thus prepared to repel a major British amphibious assault at the city of Tanga. The Germans had trained the local populace into a fine fighting force. The discipline, drill, gun handling, uniforms, and barracks had to comply with the strict German military drill codes and codes of conduct. Payouts were generous, about $10 per month. This was in 1914, and $50 a month for non-combatants. This was about double the pay that was paid to the neighboring British troops in Kenya. These men had the full backing of the German officers and would be supported by them in dealing with the population. The Askari boy would be sent ahead to the village with a cartridge to present it to the local Jumbi. The dreaded order was to provide 4 beds, one for the Askari, one for his rifle, one for his ammunition pouch, and one for his uniform. The bed was to be furnished with a blanket. This meant a woman or women. A dispute would swiftly be dealt with a bite from the koboko, wielded by the Askaris themselves. The Askaris were capable of stripping down a machine gun, operate field telegraphs, normally ran barefoot, and with their local bush knowledge were a considerable force to be reckoned with. Smuts quickly raised 20,000 men from the dorps and cities of South Africa, most of whom had returned from German West African campaign, including Richard Charles Slingsby. He had to agree, and you can see there, I, Charles Richard Slingsby, do solemnly declare, and he was pledged his obedience to the king. Tighe, waiting for the reinforcements, was led by Brigadier General Wilfred Mallinson, who under his command 2 brigades, one part Indian and one part British, the other South Africans. The South African troops were ill-trained, were confident, however, that they would quickly deal with a handful of savage black troops. Psychologically unprepared, complained even more when having to fight alongside Indian troops, with whom they regarded as coolies, and even worse, the black soldiers of the King's African Rifles. As they marched out across the dusty plains, they were at ease, convinced of an easy victory. The same day Smuts sailed for East Africa, he landed at Mombasa to be met by General Tighe, who came aboard the troop ship to inform Smuts of the disaster of Salaita Hill. Private Thompson notes in his diary, prior to the attack, as it began to rain at the Serengeti, a good many of the chaps took off their clothes and tried to get a bath in the rain, but they were worse off than before. He later wrote, got marching orders, and we were told that we would attack Salaita Fort. Great excitement. His regiment, the 7th, was to lead the attack. Only a few days earlier, Thompson had noted in his diary, heard that the Rhodesian got lost on a patrol and had been found with his arms hacked off, and later his eyes taken out. The attack was a complete fiasco, with the South African troops retiring in disorder. Thompson's diary, we lay down for about half an hour with a bullet zipping past all the time. My mule bolted for the German lines, so I let him go, and I loaded my rifle and got behind an anthill. Snipers were getting all around us. We were being shelled all the time, and then the Baluchis guarding our rear got behind us, so we retired further. The South African staff officers were furious at being defeated and blamed the British officers for the lack of leadership and dilatory and remote style of command. To the British officers, however, there was a certain satisfaction of having to rescue those South Africans who had come there despising the Indians as coolies and the Askaris as the old bad word. A final humiliation was the returning to the South African troops of abandoned machine guns, rifles, etc., by the Baluchis, with a note to remind the owners that they were sepoys and not coolies. 138 South Africans lay dead, mowed down by the machine guns, mad by the German Askaris. Smuts was furious. Van Deventer appalled. Man, he declared to his staff, they lost more in one morning than I lost in the whole Southwest Africa campaign. Turn our attention to the story of the sea. On June the 6th, 1914, the star attraction at the Dar es Salaam exhibition arrived in the port. The 3,400-ton SMS Konigsberg drew the admiration of crowds wherever she arrived in port. Her slim 375-foot hull disguised the 10 4.1-inch guns and twin torpedo tubes. At anchor, she became open house to the thousands of tribal visitors who marveled at her long guns and bright decks. During her peacetime stay on the African coast, Königberg was known as Manoari wa bomba tatu by the Africans, who believed the ship with 3 funnels to be more powerful than a ship with 2 funnels. When Commander Max Loff received the encoded message signaling the start of the war, he signaled the many German merchantmen to make for Dar es Salaam, or the nearest neutral port. Happy hunting in the Indian Ocean found the raider capturing the city of Winchester, who carried a cargo of tea valued at about $2 million. When the news reached London, the bottom of the market dropped out. Steaming over the ocean, soon used up all her coal bunkers, and the good Captain Loff was more interested in the 400 tons of bunker coal aboard the ship rather than the tea. By this action, the German Navy sunk the first merchant ship of the war. His joy of free coal was short-lived. When the good captain discovered that coal was of Bombay's finest, as with the water from Bombay, Luft described the coal as poison to our boilers. Fruitless days at sea, yet he calls the demise of the ship. The stokers were literally sweeping the coal from the hulls when the collier SMS Somali was spotted. They lashed together in mid-ocean, and about 1,000 tons of the Roar's finest was shoveled into the Konigsberg's hold. A few weeks of fruitless searching again found the need for bunkers. After meeting again with the Somali, loading was interrupted by bad weather. The Bombay coal, however, began to take its toll, and the ship's boilers needed repair. Unable to enter Dar es Salaam due to the British fleet destroying the wireless communication, Loff made for the delta of the Rafiki River. Lady Luck was on his side. The British fleet could not find the raider, and one of the fleet, after 2 months of cruising with inferior coal, pulled into the harbour at Zanzibar. The locals soon informed Loff that the 2-chimney ship in the harbour, it was a prize too good to overlook. He soon made steam and crossed the 150 miles to trap HMS Pegasus in dock. Despite a good fight by Commander J.A. Ingalls, the 4.1-inch guns pulverized the Pegasus within 10 minutes, and her 4-inch guns being no match for the superior weaponry of the Konigsberg. Hardly had the HMS Pegasus settled at the bottom of the Zanzibar harbour when the news reached London. It was like receiving the news of a cop killing. London immediately ordered Captain Sidney Drury Lowe, commanding the cruiser HMS Chatman, to make immediately for the East African coastline. The Chatman was not only faster than the Konigsberg, but carried 6-inch guns. Drury Lowe was joined by the HMS Dartmouth and the HMS Weymouth. For months, the fleet travelled up and down the coastline in search of the Konigsberg. Despite many false alarms, the German ship remained elusive. Finally, the Dartmouth captured the German tug adjutant and the merchantman president, disguised as a hospital ship, and gave up the secret of the Rafiki Delta when the British captured the modern charts of the Delta. The Delta of the 400-mile-long Rafiki contains the largest mangrove swamp forest in the world. This sodden embrace of mud and sandbanks, writhing in crocodiles, snarling mosquitoes, trembling with the crash of elephants. Loef had navigated far up the river and had tucked his ship away under the forest canopy. He had no intention of stagnating in the Delta while his crew died of malaria. But no breakout of this jail could be attempted while his engines coughed and wheezed. He pondered how he could get his ship to Dar es Salaam for repairs. If not by sea, why not by land? Having enlisted the aid of several German farmers and the African laborers, built 2 immense wooden sledges. Upwards of 1,000 men lifted the dismantled boilers onto the sledges, who dragged the damaged machines to the dockyard of Dar es Salaam. A journey of almost a month, and had to repeat it once again once the boilers were repaired. The guns were dismounted from the deck and placed on a well-camouflaged emplacements along the river. After 2 months, the boilers were back, and the Konigsberg engines sounded every bit as good as they were when they left the shipyard in Kiel. Jury Low bottled the Delta entrances, tried to find the range of the Konigsberg. When his support vessels had called for other theatres of war, the Chatman found herself alone as the jailer. Drury Lane had no way of knowing where the Konigsberg lay. King Hall in Cape Town heard of a pilot, Cutler, who with a single-engine Curtiss hydroplane was doing exhibition flying in Durban. Cutler was granted a reserve commission. Sadly, the plane developed serious radiator leak, but being South African, the Boer had a plan gemaak, and with a forward radiator was fitted. The third attempt, the Curtiss spotted the Konigsberg, but on his return, the plane crashed. Nicknamed Cuckoo, the plane never flew again. As the end of the year approached, Loef had crept deeper into the Delta. Christmas arrived, and the Germans played soccer and drank the last of their wine. The British celebrated in the heat of the tropics. One of the ship's carpenters made up several model coffins, which were released to intimidate the German crew. Radio silence was breached with the following message: "Koning, we wish you the best of good cheer, but blame you for stopping our Christmas beer." Minutes later, a reply crackled on: "Thanks. The same to you. If you want to see me, I'm always at home. Loef." March saw a change of guard. The angling battleship Goliath completed the transport of troops from German West Africa under the flag of Vice Admiral King Hall. The Royal Navy had not given up the idea of air reconnaissance, and the pilot Col arrived with a Stoppush Schneider. Mechanical failure, however, prevented any serious flying. The engine was designed to fly in the cold chimes of England and overheated, causing a spectacular crash, which Col managed to swim away from the wreck. Enter the famous big game hunter, Pieter Pretorius. He was later promoted to major. Familiar to thousands of local natives, known as Matanda Bantu, friendly to all people, tanned and withered from 25 years hunting and farming, reputed to have killed 577 elephants in his time, the enemy of the Germans, for chasing him off his farm, heard of the war from the Portuguese traders. Tasked with finding the Konigsberg, Pretorius dressed up as an assistant of an Indian trader, boarded a ship, and sent back valuable intelligence to the British fleet. Later disguised as an Arab fisherman, he sounded and mapped the Delta, plotting the positions of the Konigsberg's guns. His intelligence collected was crucial to the success of sinking the Konigsberg. Life on the Konigsberg was not much fun. The crew had no letters from home. Food was scarce, and the crews survived on fish and hippo shot to supply meat and fat. Despite the Germans sending a disguised ship to rescue, the Königberg remained a prisoner of the Delta. Just to digress a little bit, Major Pieter Pretorius, after the war was ended, he was employed by the state to destroy the herds of elephants eating up the farms in the Eastern Cape. After destroying the elephant population, and with only 16 animals left, the public outcry convinced the administration to stop. The Reverend Kinghorn and Pretorius assisted in establishing the Addo Park. His story is remembered in a book, The Jungle Man, compiled from his own notes 2 years after his death in 1945. At the end of April, Col had been given another seaplane. This time making it up the Delta, found the Konigsberg, and despite heavy fire from rifles and guns of the Konigsberg, Col plotted the ship. King Hall had earlier called for 2 shallow drafted monitors. These ships, with tinfoil armor and outsized guns, were designed for the defense in shallow waters. Late in spring 1915, the Mersey and the Severn were towed to East Africa. King Hall had all hands to repair reinforced drums lashed inside the hulls, etc. After 5 weeks, the ships were ready. Rehearsals followed, their firepower being directed by the aircraft Cauldrons and Henry Farms. July the 7th, the Mersey and the Severn made an unsuccessful attempt to sink the Konigsberg. King Hall decided to withdraw, though, rather than risk severe damage. A few days later, the assault recommences with the assistance of Col and his aeroplane, finds the Konigsberg and directs the gunners and their firepower. And finally, the ship's radio crackles from Col. HT, hit target. A few minutes later, target destroys. Then a final radio report. We have been hit. Please send a boat for us. The original crew of 475 officers and men, 145 lived to serve with Von Lettow and the Schutztruppe. Captain Loff went off to Dar es Salaam to prepare the port for defense. Loof rescued all the land-based guns and retrieved the balance of the hull, mostly from underwater. The Germans mounted the guns as field artillery. However, the high explosive shells designed to pierce armor plating of ships was not very effective against troops. The Königberg guns, some of the Königberg guns are now found in Johannesburg and Pretoria. Of interest, the Konigsberg was supplied by coal by the President, a former passenger steamer, converted into a coal supply ship, sunk by HMS Chatman. She lay hidden in the creek of the Lindy River. After the war, Irvin and Johnson acquired the salvage rights. She was repaired and towed to Saldanha Bay to be used as a coal bunker. Most of the ship was cut above the waterline, was later sold as scrap. The remainder being filled with limestone, and it served as a jetty. It is still used today by the Naval Gym as its official jetty. Returning to the land forces, invading German East Africa presented geographic problems. The railway line through Voi allowed for an easy supply line, but pressing through the south of Kilimanjaro, threading past lakes, rivers, the route was blocked by the hills of Salaita. Smuts was not prepared to take the head-on approach, but preferred the flanking, outmaneuvering approach favored by the Boer generals. His reasoning was a quick dash through the Taveta Gap to penetrate the German territory and deliver a final crushing blow to Von Lettow's army. Although largely South African, The new force was heterogeneous phalanx. Its regiments and battalions had been drawn from 3 continents and confused each other with a babble of national languages and obscure dialects. The most seasoned units were sepoys of the 129th and the 130 Baluchis. These warriors from the Afghan border were described as lean and lithe and being of splendid physique, trained, as one of the officers put it, tradition of heavy gunfire, to being slaughtered patiently, and to the necessity of pushing home assaults. The South Africans were 2 brigades in strength, one under Brigadier General Breves and the other Brigadier General Van Deventer, both officers having served in the German West Africa campaign. One would expect conflict, as a Boer general with a guttural cloak, a legacy of the British bullet, met with the British generals, Brigadier Michael Tighe, a florid-faced, hard-drinking Irishman, Brigadier General Wilfred Mallinson, described as a bad man, clever as a monkey, unreliable, and with bad record behind him. He knows little about active operations and comes from a class that would wreck the empire to sacrifice himself. Smuts had as his senior intelligence officer Captain Richard Meinerhagen, not a German spy, as his name may suggest, but the son of a prominent London banker. A career soldier, he had extensive African experience in bush warfare, describing the English senior officers nearer to fossils than active, energetic leaders of men. He did, however, appreciate Smuts, whom he found would grasp the situation immediately without having to repeat himself. Smuts' plan worked, and after heavy fighting, managed to press Von Lettow to withdrawing to the railhead at Tighe. Van Deventer managed to get his column close to Askari. Van Lettow's intelligence informed him that Van Deventer was already at Askari. The war may well have ended here if the South African troops had been there and encircled Van Lettow, who managed to escape the trap. Smuts found time to write home on the 14th. Dearest Mama, it is a little quieter today, and so I want to send you a line. We have a memorable week behind us. On Tuesday night, a week ago, we left to encircle the enemy from the right, and we worked so fast that on Sunday morning, the enemy were in full flight southwards, and the whole of Kilimanjaro and the Menu country was in our possession. The spirit among our young burghers was excellent. The Battle of Katovo, the area of the battle, was a repetition of Spionkop. We charged continually, and we were always beaten back. But at about 8 p.m. on Saturday evening, I sent 2,000 Afrikaners for the final charge, and the bushy ridge at Rieta and the Tima were taken by parties of Transvaalers, while the rest were again repulsed. It was a joyful victory. It was interesting to note that Smuts writes and equates Afrikaners to all South African troops. And so the long chase down the Pangani River commenced. When the troops were not digging, sleepwalking, or shooting, they were raving and dying of disease. The most widespread sickness was malaria, the manifestations of which caused chills, heat stroke, epileptic seizures, delirium, tremors, cardiac failure, and insanity. The British suffered much more from malaria than did the Germans, due in the main to the military dress. The British in short sleeves, shirts and trousers. The Germans wore long sleeves and full-length breeches. Everyone caught dysentery, amoebic or bacillary, or both, from the contaminated food and water. There was also relapsing fever, caused by ticks. Small cuts often expanded into livid, subterranean jungle sores. Jigger fleas, budded into a man's toe and laid 7 million eggs, and had to be extracted with a pin or knife. Literally thousands of British, Indian, and African toes were amputated on this march down the Central Railway. Our clothing consisted of a mosquito shirt, a spine protector, a pair of shorts, puttees, helmets, and ground sheet. One dug, once trenched with one's bayonet, cut grass and branches to lie on, secured the ground sheet at the corners, sloping slightly towards the feet, so as to shed off the rain into an empty biscuit tin, so wrote Major Barr of the 6th SA Infantry. Rations did not come up in time. Men set out on life or death operations with nothing but a cup of coffee or few hardtack biscuits. Men scavenged in the fields for sweet potatoes, stealing crops and stock from the peasants' fields, shooting game for fresh meat. The main rations were salt, bully beef, biscuits that had to be crushed, sugar, flour, oatmeal, and tea. Men wrote of going for 18 hours with nothing to sustain them, while some officers were only concerned for their whiskey supplies and their dainties. In contrast, Smuts, when visiting General Headquarters in Nairobi, found several dugout generals, several of them deliberately sent there by the War Office in London. Living comfortably, they dressed for dinner every night, not in mess kit, but in a posh tussore silk khaki uniform. Piet van der Bijl describes the following story. Now, as we started down the Pangani, one of them arrived at the front, travelling in great style with a gang of bearers, carrying boxes of Fortnum and Mason, Piccadilly, filled with such things as pâté de foie gras and caviar, half bottles of champagne, tinned cheese, butter, biscuits, and other delicacies. Smuts, who had lived like the rest of the army on rations when they were obtainable, asked him at once, with some irritation, when he thought he would be able to span the Pangani with a bridge strong enough to carry heavy vehicles and guns. Pangani? Where is that? Asked the spotlessly attired general. Smuts exploded. Heavens, General, we've been walking down it for a week. Go and get your map, boy. Go and get your map. Conductor Charles Slingsby was promoted to lieutenant by Order Major General van Deventer, routine order number 16, dispatched from Kilosa, whilst deployed as a divisional troops transport officer. The British administration formed a military labour organisation, the Karia Corps, which was immediately recruited and conscripted over 400,000 African men for portage and other supported tasks. The Karia Corps carried everything the soldiers needed to survive during the East African campaign of the First World War. The Corps suffered heavier casualties than almost all the other units put together. The wretched medical services. Once the army started to rumble down the Pangani River, supplies were limited. Some diary notes to understand the conditions. Private Thompson writes, I was taken to the Indian hospital on a stretcher, put in a tent on the ground, given no food. On the 5th of April, no food for 18 hours. Hospital cook bought half a loaf of bread and some jam. Gunner Lewis, for the 4th Battery. While off saddling, I suddenly came over sick and cold, and was told to report to the doctor without delay. We were taken to an empty house and laid on blankets on the cement floor. All night left in agony, no medicine. Our water bottles were empty. 2 days later, Lewis describes the journey to Nairobi. What a fearful journey. An iron truck, a little straw strewn on the floor. The 40-odd sick men huddled up in every conceivable shape and form, some with fever, some with dysentery and other diseases, groaning in their pain in pitch darkness. Gunner Jackson of the 2nd Artillery, Gilissa Hospital for convalescent fever patients. Breakfast, mealie meal porridge, no milk or sugar. Coffee and a slice of dry bread. Lunch, stew and dry bread. Tea, dry bread and a pint of tea. Private Frank Reed, formerly a barrister and later secretary of the OD Union, describes the march. Sometimes it was a quagmire. Sometimes the road would be impassable. It meant getting out pangas, cutting down small trees, branches, and long grass to lay across the track to provide something of a foothold for the animals and retrieve the AT carts sinking into the mud axle deep. Despite all the shrieking of the miserable little Indian driver, we could be heard all along the line. An unlimited twisting of oxen's tails. One or two of the poor beasts could go no further and sank down exhausted in the mud. One Memorial Day, we spent 16 hours of foot slogging and hard labor on the road to make less than 10 miles. Private Shackleton records the last stages of the march to the Kondo Irangi. As we moved out of the wagons, began to sink in the swampy ground. The oxen had to be outspanned and the wagons had to be unloaded and man-hauled to higher ground. There was no rest for the men to push the vehicles from behind. Everywhere along the trails, stretching as far back as Lol Kaseli, lay the carcasses of horses, mules, and oxen. Attacked by sickness and tsetse flies, the unfortunate animals had been discarded by the mountain troops. The stench of rotting bodies was sickening. Hordes of bushflies rose in clouds from the carcasses as men circled past. At night we set guards against lions, leopards, hyenas, and jackals, and built thorn bomas and burned big fires to protect the frightened oxen. It rained continuously. While we marched through another long day, from sunrise to sunset, through the dank jungle, to the end of it, we were served our rations. Half a cup of flour per man, nothing else. It was too wet to make a fire. I put my flour ration in my tin mug and held it out in the rain, and then drank the thin paste. Once the army left the railway supply line, they would have to depend on other means of logistical support. 3 mechanical transport companies, 1 bullock cart company, and 6 ox train companies. The bulk of the stores had to be carried on their heads and slung on the poles of the train of the 9 carrier companies, and thousands of chanting men who also had to be fed. Lieutenant Colonel Dodson and Lieutenant Colonel Jack Rose devised a new species of locomotive. By narrowing the gauge of the heavy motor lorries, moved the rubber tires and the wheels, replaced them with steel wheels suitable for the train track. They could carry 5 tons in the lorry and 10 more in the trailer. These Rio trains were trucks sourced from the USA and Canada. The ravages of tsetse fly, horse sickness, and other animal diseases guaranteed the life and transport of the cavalry would be very short. A trooper writes, "My company had lost half its strength through fever, and many of the horses we could go no further without remounts. The horses were all but finished, poor, lean, staggering creatures. Many a shot was heard as the men put the beast out of his misery." Questions were raised why this huge expenditure of animals could not have been saved if there had been no advance down the Pangani. Why didn't we make an amphibious landing at Dar es Salaam? The trouble was that such a landing would have to be made during the northeast monsoon. Smuts had the defeat of Tighe in mind, and the tropical diseases of the coastal area would have been worse. Denise Rates recalls, "It was pitiful to see the fever-racked men dragging themselves along on foot, for their animals were dead and had ceased to be mounted. More than 30,000 of these gentle beasts had died. The BE-2 had always been a bad press. It had become an unpopular aircraft by 1916. By this time, at least 3 serious weaknesses as a warplane. The first was that its small air-cooled inline motor made it seriously underpowered and was unreliable, even by the standards of the time. When bombs were to be carried, or maximum endurance was required, the observer and the gun had to be left behind. Although the BE-2C had a reasonable performance in 1914-1915, it remained in service long after much more powerful aircraft had become available to the enemy. In Kenyatta Avenue, there stands a war memorial with 3 figures: the carrier, the King's African rifleman, and an Arab rifleman. The inscription reads, "This is to the memory of the native troops, African troops, who fought, to the carriers who were the feet and hands of the army, and so to all other men who served and died for their king and country in the Eastern African Great War, 1914-1918. If you fight for your country, even if you die, your sons will remember your name." Transport through this hilly, steamy jungle was almost impossible. A lack of railways, disease took a toll of animal transport. Mechanized transport in its infancy, all had remained was human transport. It is difficult in today's world to understand how this would have been implemented. With the labor laws, health and safety, and unions, would this scheme have been reasonable? African porters were recruited throughout East Africa on both sides. A German officer required at least 6 porters to carry his kit. The British officers were just as bad, and it was not long before the military bureau took charge. In typical British style, the operation had to be organized. The dumping system was born. Each man had to carry 50 pounds of portage. This did not include his carrier's personal sleeping blankets, cooking utensils, and food. The gang was a party of 125 porters who walked 12 miles, whose permanent posts were built. Each post had 50 laborers for building bundas, digging drains, and latrines. For the statisticians, a carrier carried 50 pounds, a donkey or an ox 120 pounds, a mule 200 pounds, and a Ford truck 700 pounds. A column of fighting men would require at least 16,000 carriers. These poor men were unused to the diet of flour and rice and suffered from incredible intestinal disorders. In total, due to disease, over 100,000 men lost their lives during this campaign. This terrible loss of life amongst the young men of a whole generation had far-reaching and traumatic effects on the social, economic, and emotional life of these peoples. Lieutenant Colonel G.A. Morris was appointed as the officer commanding of the newly formed Cape Corps. Within 6 days of the battalion being established, attested, there were more than 1,000 men that signed up. Drawn from the so-called Cape Coloured group, the bulk of whom were drawn from labouring class of South African. Their forefathers had worn the red tunics of the British and some of the uniforms of the Dutch against innumerable native campaigns as foot soldiers and cavalry. Although used as labour and transport drivers, their skill with horses, mules, and oxen, and their own carefree fashion earned them a special place within the British Army. Towards the end of the war, the Cape Corps was engaged with the enemy as a fighting unit, with the King's African Rifles, and units of the South African Mounted Regiment. So fierce was the fighting that the Germans came out with white flags flying. This unit was the only South African unit to be awarded battle honours for their part in the war, and were commended by the War Office for their zeal and valuable service. The war dragged on. Von Lettow took his army south, through the malaria lands, the troops and the animals suffering the most terrible privations, past the Rafiki, where the Navy had done duty, and on to Portuguese East Africa. Smuts found himself unpopular with his men when he was recalled to South Africa for a hero's welcome. Did not repeat the extraordinary incident in Dar es Salaam. As a conquering general on his way to receive every honor that king and country could bestow at his request, he asked for parade to salute and greet the repatriation on medical grounds of 400 officers and 7,000 men. The officers refused, and the adjutant, Captain Rupert Pilkington Jordan, had to tell Smuts. Smuts made no comment, but to order the men onto parade and address them upon the hardship of the campaign. Von Lettow took his army into northern Rhodesia. When riding his bicycle, he was intercepted by Captain Miller, who read the dispatch to him. The Prime Minister of England has announced an armistice was signed in 5 hours on November 11th, and all hostilities ceased forthwith. Von Lettow surrendered to Captain Hawkins of the KAR on the 25th of November, 1919. The Kenyatta Avenue stands a war memorial with these three figures: the carrier, African rifleman, and the Arab rifleman. During the East African campaign, Charles, like many other others, is returned to South Africa with tropical disease. A great shock to his family. While back in Pretoria, he meets Violet Alice Dove in Pretoria, a Cape Town girl doing war effort in Pretoria, meets her and marries her all within 1 week. A marriage that lasted for over 50 years. World War II, Charles signs up again. He's now too old to do active service, but is appointed as a staff officer to General Wakefield in Pretoria, the Cape Peninsula Rifles in Cape Town, and finally as commandant of the Wynberg military camp. He always related to me a wonderful story. At Gordon's Bay, there was a naval gun to protect the Cape from marauding U-boats that were operational all around the Cape during World War II. And he was always petrified as he went out to pay the wages of the men, as he was the adjutant, that a submarine would somehow pop out of False Bay and shoot him. But of course that never happened, so the old boy lived on for much longer. This is the War Memorial in the Cape Town Gardens. Losses of the British Army forces lost 343 killed in action, with 6,558 died of diseases. This doesn't include all those poor carrier guys that from the local men from Kenya. South African losses in the war were 986.
David, I found your talk extremely interesting in that I've, in Chronicles, done stories on Southwest and East Africa. But at no stage did I record the drastic problems that they had in their campaign.
I think people always remember the First World War for all those trench warfare in France and the terrible conditions that they had there, and that's always shown, but there doesn't seem to be any footage or shown of the terrible troubles that people went through in the East Africa campaign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure to have you with us. I see Hendrik is also here. And thank you, David, for your very interesting presentation. We really enjoyed it.